We're going to be talking about the ICC arrest warrant that, well, The Hague has decided to place over Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and our idiot own Prime Minister essentially backing it, not having the spine or the cojones of even Joe Biden. That's saying something, isn't it? Decrepit old fossil. But in basically rejecting this. And then I was getting ready for Eylon Levy to join me, which is normally down the line. And then all of a sudden, Russell's been moved to the other side of the studio because he's here in person. I thought, wow. Honestly, this is such a privilege. I feel like in the UK, you've become a bit of a sort of pin-up for common sense when it comes to defending Israel.
Which has made me rather a red flag for some people on the wrong side.
Yeah, you were just saying to us during the advert break, you went to speak at your old college, Brasenose, and you had got 8 bodyguards and all the protesters.
Yeah, because protesters blocked the entrance to the college. People couldn't get out, and they were crying, from Oxford to Gaza, we will have an intifada. Let's be clear what that is. That's a call for targeted political violence against Jews and Israelis. It's a call for suicide bombings, frankly. The second intifada was a wave of suicide bombings in Israel during the early 2000s, and that's what these protesters are calling for. So these are scary times.
They are scary times, indeed. And which is why you would think that we need to show mettle as a country. We already messed about when it came to a sort of half-baked fake news arms embargo against Israel, just preventing a few widgets, but the message sent out from the Starmer government was, well, we're going to pay lip service to supporting Israel. They've got the right to defend itself. We're going to pay lip service to the other side. The bullies who would rather intimidate MPs and intimidate governments to actually revoking support. And so now here we have this utterly farcical, ludicrous ICC arrest warrant, when we know they didn't send out an arrest warrant for, well, you name it, Assad or Khamenei, or, you know, all these horrible people around, you know, President Xi Jinping for the genocide of Uyghurs. It goes on and on and on. We know as well that Israel has endured some of the most violent, horrific attacks on its sovereignty, on its right to exist. We know as well that Israel has constantly protested for making sure that civilians are safe, airdropping leaflets, sending text messages, calling for mass evacuation, that Hamas hides within communities. We know that Hamas steals food aid, sells it on for inflationary prices, wants to deliberately starve its people. We know Israel recently backed a huge mass vaccination rollout for the people of Gaza. So just on the basis of these facts, and I want to call them facts because I believe they are facts, not propaganda, this shouldn't even exist, this arrest warrant, let alone should our Prime Minister essentially be so lily-livered that when asked, so does that mean you would arrest Benjamin Netanyahu if he came to the UK, he couldn't say.
You're absolutely right. The ICC arrest warrants are a travesty of justice by a court that has had to distort the facts, twist the law, in order to issue arrest warrants for the democratic leader of a democratic country that isn't even a member of the court, and to do it for trying to fight what the court says is the threat of extermination. They also issued arrest warrants for one of the Hamas leaders who's dead, by the way. I don't know how they expect him to get to the court. And they said that on October 7th, what Hamas did was to attempt the crime against humanity of extermination. And Hamas told Israel, we're going to do that again and again after the acts of rape and the beheadings and the burnings of October 7th. And so Israel is fighting a just war to remove Hamas from power and to bring back the hostages. And what the ICC has done now is essentially join the war against Israel by telling not just Israel, democratic countries around the world, if terrorists perpetrate barbaric atrocities against you and you take military action to remove them from power, while doing everything you can to avoid harm to civilians, and the terrorists are hiding among them, we will tie your hands and we will come after you and you cannot defend yourselves. And that's why even in Israel, the politicians who have been most critical of the Prime Minister and think that he's mucked up how he's handled the war, think that this is an absolute travesty of justice for the court to come after the Prime Minister and the former Defence Minister for trying to fight against Hamas and to bring the hostages home.
I mean, I can understand very much. I mean, you've got ordinary people who sit there and they see some of the devastating footage, they read things online about the number of civilian casualties, which frankly, if all wars around the world, past, future and present, had the same amount of sort of blow-by-blow attention, most people would be disturbed at what goes on in war. Wars are horrible. We know it's a very sort of dense urbanised area. We don't have accurate statistics. I think we're not going to know that until all is said and done. But the problem is all of these people say, well, it's awful, civilians mustn't be caught in the crosshairs. which anyone could sympathise with and say, well, yes, of course, they shouldn't, never seems to give an alternative. Then what? Because there have been negotiations constantly for ceasefires. Time and again, it seems to me that Hamas come and demand something that clearly Israel has said from the beginning, we can't give you this. They won't even release the hostages. What else is Israel supposed to do?
War is hell, and there is a reason that Israel didn't start this war, didn't want this war. This is a war that Hamas declared on October 7th with an invasion by air, land and sea, the brutal, savage massacre of 1,200 people and the abduction of 250 hostages. 101 of them are still there, including 2 children, a 1-year-old baby and a 4-year-old, I think he's 5 by now, and a British citizen by the name of Emily Damari, who is still a hostage in Gaza. And I haven't seen anyone who has presented an alternative military plan for how Israel could have removed Hamas from power and achieved the legitimate military goal of neutralizing that threat. People don't understand how small Israel is. We're not talking about Afghanistan or Iraq thousands of miles away. Gaza is Israel's back door. It's its backyard. You know, we had people who went to a music festival on October 6th, like Glastonbury, and were abducted and found themselves in Gaza. It would be like going to Glastonbury and then getting abducted into Afghanistan, except it's right on your doorstep.
Right, being taken to Wales or something.
Right, exactly.
Wales went
but none of Israel's critics have ever presented an alternative plan for how Israel should have removed Hamas. And the ICC was able to issue these arrest warrants because of all the experts they consulted. They didn't consult a single military expert. And that's because every single general who has experience of what war is like in Iraq, in Afghanistan, against ISIS, and the UK was involved in all 3, knows how difficult it is to target terrorists when they are hiding among civilians. And they have a great deal of respect and admiration for the efforts that the Israeli military has had to take to minimize harm to civilians when the terrorist strategy, it's their strategy, is to maximize harm to their own civilians because they know that it looks bad on TV and they think that will generate pressure on Israel to abandon the hostages. And by the way, there was a vote that came up at the Security Council just a few days ago that called for an unconditional ceasefire and demanded the release of the hostages. The UK voted for that. It voted for a ceasefire that was unconditional, not conditional on the release of the hostages. It told Israel, you should end the war even if you don't get the hostages back. And that's truly outrageous because we're not going to abandon them and we're not going to leave the Hamas terror regime able to perpetrate another October 7th.
Where is the international pressure on neighbouring countries? We know that Egypt has closed its borders. They don't want anything to do with taking in Palestinians. The Gulf states, by and large, I don't know, but I think some of them are quite tacitly supportive of Israel dealing with this issue. They're fed up with a region constantly ridden with conflict and this internecine warfare that continues to blight the whole of the Middle East. And yet we don't hear anything about international pressure on those countries to do the good thing. And what we do hear is, well, you know, it's not a level playing field, is it? Well, Israel, they're very strong, they're a far bigger and more competent army. And I'm there saying, well, why on earth does this country need an Iron Dome? I mean, that alone, to me, is evidence of what Israel lives under.
Not only is there no pressure on Israel's neighbours, Israel is getting blamed for their problems. I said that the ICC arrest warrants are based on totally distorting the facts. Israel is accused of closing a border crossing that is between Gaza and Egypt. Right. Egypt closed the border crossing. It had nothing to do with Israel. Israel can't force Egypt to open one of its own border crossings. But there is now an arrest warrant against the Israeli Prime Minister for shutting a crossing with Egypt. It's completely insane. You're right, though, that the Gulf countries are tacitly supporting Israel because they understand what this war is about. This is a regional war being led by the Iranian regime. Israel is under attack on 7 fronts. And I'll spell them out because that's not obvious. Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthi pirates in Yemen, Iranian militias in Syria, Iranian militias in Iraq, Palestinian terrorists in the West Bank, and the Iranian regime itself. On any given day when we have rocket attacks and sirens, they could be coming from 4 or 5 different directions. And these are all Iranian proxy armies. The Iranian regime has filled the Middle East with a ring of fire, a coalition of terrorist proxy armies surrounding Israel because they want to destroy Israel. And so the neighboring countries understand this isn't a war between Israel and a Palestinian terrorist group in Gaza. This is a regional war being waged by the same Iranian regime that is a threat to Saudi Arabia, that is a threat to the UAE and is also a threat to the United Kingdom. And if we're going to look a little bit down the line, it is absolutely essential that we work together to prevent the Iranian regime from getting nuclear weapons. They're a hair's breadth away. The UK is taking diplomatic action to try to prevent that. But if the Iranian regime is able to get nuclear weapons while filling the region with all these armies that have missiles and drones, the Middle East will be a much more dangerous place, not only for Israel, but for our Western partners too.
I understand domestically the politics of this country, perhaps what Sir Keir Starmer fears. And again, during the advert break, you were talking that when speaking to MPs, you've been told about MPs who, because they voted a certain way, have had their constituency offices attacked that must carry panic buttons. We know we face a very clear and distinct domestic threat of terrorism here. I don't think we've been strong enough with dealing with some of this. I don't think we've been strong enough in dealing with the ostentatious marches that take place most weekends, and when we know that they're in part corralled and curated by hostile foreign actors and terrorist organisations. But Starmer does have to find some sort of balance. It is his duty as well to protect his own MPs, particularly, I'd imagine, Labour MPs, who might be most at risk when it comes to these things. I don't know, but let's assume that's the case. Does his sort of word soup here essentially say, well, I back the International Criminal Court, he is, of course, himself a former prosecutor, but not really answering about whether this would mean arresting Netanyahu himself if he came here? Is that enough? Is that a sort of compromise that Israelis can live with?
Look, I was a spokesman for the Israeli government at the start of the war, but I'm British. I grew up here, I went to university here, I went to school here, and what is happening in Britain concerns me as a British citizen. You are seeing the derangement around the Israel issue fueling political violence in Britain that is making even MPs think twice about whether they want to speak up and express their opinions. I spoke to MPs in Parliament this week who told me about how their constituency offices were getting vandalised and trashed. One MP who has to carry a panic button. MPs who aren't allowed to take public transport and they get a special allowance to take taxis because it's too dangerous for them. MPs are having to think twice. Now, if you live in a country where your members of parliament aren't able to speak freely, it means they can't pursue what they think is their own national interest freely. They can't do what they think is right for Britain because they're intimidated and they're scared about how nutters are going to come and pour red paint all over their front door. That is really dangerous for Britain. And I would want Britain's leaders to try to address this, not by hemming and hawing and saying the protesters, well, maybe you have a point, we're going to strike a balance, but by saying we stand firmly with our ally Israel as it fights for its survival on 7 fronts, as it takes action against a terrorist regime that is threatening to do October 7th again and again. International law is important, humanitarian aid is important, but we do have a side in this conflict. And that side is our democratic ally, the State of Israel, as it fights for its survival against countries that are enemies of the United Kingdom as well. And I think that moral clarity will go a great deal towards giving strength to MPs who are scared to speak and to start to push back against some of the craziness from the deranged protesters who think they own the streets.
Moral clarity. We should be so lucky to have any of that in any form here in the United Kingdom. Eylon, it's so good to have you in the studio. Thank you so much for coming in.